Hello and welcome to Sage and Stone Homestead. My name is Heather. Here on our little slice of heaven in southwestern Kentucky, my husband Levi, our 4 children, and I raise as much of our own food as possible. In the spring and summer months, that includes a nice big garden, and we grow a lot of produce out of our greenhouse. And in the fall and winter months, we have a lot of meat that we grow, we process, and then we put away. So the pressure canner is a really integral part of our whole system here. We put up a lot of food every year, and we couldn't do it without our pressure canner. So when you're thinking about learning how to can, there's 2 different types of canners. You have basically your water bath canner or your pressure canner. Now, instead of a water bath canner, we use a steam canner here. I love it. I have a separate video on that I'll link at the end of this one. But really, the steam canner is only good for high acid foods. So things like jams, jellies, pickles, salsas, tomato products in general. That's what that's good for. But low acid foods like meats, broths, green beans, things like that, that has to be pressure canned. And the reason for that is there is a spore in most foods and really in the air, so it gets all over and in everything, called botulism. And this botulism spore can live through boiling, and it can live through some really high temps, and it really thrives in a vacuum. It thrives in an oxygen-free environment. So if you were to boil a can of chicken and get it hot and put it on the counter, it would seal. The lid would suck down and you would have an oxygen-free environment, but you wouldn't have killed all of the really dangerous pathogens like the botulism in that kind of system. Boiling only gets up to 212. This process gets up to 240 and beyond, which will kill botulism, and that's the only way you can safely prepare low acid foods. So the hope of this video is to help you chill out a little bit if you're freaked out about your canner. I was as well. When I first got this canner and first got it going, truth be told, I was not in the kitchen while it was running. So I could hear it running, I could tell everything was going well, but I was terrified of this thing. I did not allow the kids into the kitchen. I just knew that I did something wrong and that it was gonna blow up. Rest assured that today's canners have a lot of different safety features where basically if something is going to go wrong, it has to go really wrong. It has to be a serious neglect situation. In general, with good practice, really it's completely safe to use. I've had my canner for 4 years and I love it. It's nothing fancy. It's the Presto pressure canner. I'll link it in the description box. It's really important to note that when you're shopping for a pressure canner, that you don't assume that pressure cooker is synonymous with pressure canner, because it's not. They're designed differently. A pressure canner is designed to heat your food to a safe level in order to make it shelf stable. There's a couple different things about canners versus cookers, so make sure that what you're buying is a canner. And as I mentioned, this really isn't anything fancy, but it does the job very well. It comes with a dial gauge up here, which I have never calibrated, so I don't really use it much. I use it as a general guide, but in order to determine our pressure, and we'll go over this when we really get to our canning, I actually use the weighted gauge over here. This little weight comes with it, and I actually have it set. It comes with different little weights here. I have it set to 10 pounds, which is perfect for our altitude. We'll go over all of this in just a minute, but as far as purchasing canners go, I feel like honestly the weighted gauge is going to be a lot more reliable. So if you have the option to have one or the other, go with one that has the weighted gauge on it, or get one that has both, and you'll be able to use the weighted gauge part of it. Also, as you can see here, our range hood has a microwave built into it. I looked into the All-American pressure canners, and the All-American like double stacker doesn't fit underneath my microwave, so definitely take that into consideration. And also you can notice that I am canning on a glass top stove. So I actually have the manual to this stove, and in the manual it says that it's safe to can on. Some manufacturers don't want you doing it because the sheer weight of the canner can provide too much pressure and be a little bit of a problem for your glass top stove, but we have not had any kind of issue. But again, our manufacturer for our stove, they say that it's safe. So I mentioned a little bit ago that I have the double stack. And what that means is this canner is big enough that I can fit like 2 rows of pints or 2 rows of half pints or a row of pints and a row of half pints in here. So I have the ability to can a whole lot of food. This particular canner fits 7 quarts at one time, 26 half pints or 20 pints. So you can get a whole lot done when you have the taller canner, as long as it fits under your microwave. If you're going to stack, or you're going to plan to stack, you're going to want to get another one of these racks. So you do need one of these canning racks anyway to go in the bottom of the canner to elevate the food off of the bottom of the canner so that it doesn't crack the glass. You don't want anything bad happening to your precious food, and this is going to keep that up off the bottom of the canner and keep that safe. So we're going to plop this in here. So today we're going to be canning 7 quarts of rabbit. Now, I'm going to be using a raw pack method, which I think is a really smart type method to start out with if you've never done anything with the pressure canner before. This is already kind of, you know, a little bit of a complicated process. And if you have to worry about maintaining the heat on the canner while you're trying to heat up your food and keep your jars heated and juggle all of that, it can just be a lot to really work with when it's your first time. So if you can work with a recipe that has a raw pack to start out with, that means you start with, you know, room temperature jars, room temperature or cold food. Like in my case, I'm canning rabbit today, so that came out of the refrigerator. And because of that, we're also going to be starting with a cold canner. So there's no pressure to kind of rush through this process because I'm not getting scared that stuff is going to cool down too much. So here is the rabbit that we're working with. Like I mentioned before, straight out of the refrigerator. I cut it up into its pieces and I have it packed in the jar with the bones. So I haven't added any water. Any juices you see in here just came from the meat. So we just packed in our meat to about 1.25 inches headspace. And what headspace is the amount of air between the food and the upper rim of the jar. It's important to keep the headspace as the recipe intends, because if you have too much headspace or too little headspace, it will affect the seal and the longevity of the jar on the shelf if it seals at all. So I have this handy dandy headspace tool, and this tool is just going to help me get a guide for where my food is sitting inside the jar. You can also just kind of eyeball the side of the jar. Usually this from the tippy top to this little edge of the threading here, that's about 1 inch. And so if I place the food about 1/4 inch below that, I'm generally pretty good there. But if I wanted to double check myself, I could use this headspace tool, and the stair steps only go down to 1 inch, but again, I can eyeball and see if I'm 1.25 inches headspace like I should be. Now that we got the headspace all figured out and the jars are all packed, I do have the option to add 1 teaspoon of salt per jar, and I will do that just because I always do and I feel like it lends a nice flavor to the meat, but you don't have to. If you've done any water bath canning before, the process of getting things ready is basically the same. So I want to make sure that the rims of the jars are completely clean and that the jars don't have any cracks. It is a little bit sad when you go to wipe the rim of your jar and you're getting ready to can and you have to repack a jar because the jar rim or something has a chip or a crack. You don't want to use anything defective because it can go wrong. And not in a catastrophic bad way, I don't want to scare you, but I have had jars crack in the canner, both the water bath canner and the pressure canner, and it's just a sad thing to have to clean up. It's nothing catastrophic really. So what I've done is I've added some vinegar to a towel here, and I'm just going to be wiping the rims clean, making sure that there's nothing that's on the rim that's going to get in the way of us getting a proper seal. And part of how we are going to get them to seal perfectly is using my brand new 4 jars canning lids. So this is the first time I will get to try these things out. So far at first glance, I am really impressed. These lids are actually much thicker and they seem much sturdier than your standard, even the ball lid, because instead of being 0.10 or 0.12 millimeters thickness, they're actually 0.18 and they contain a little bit of stainless steel to help prevent rust. And that's the reason that I reached out to 4Jars and asked them if they could send me a sample, because I not only saw that it was an American brand, but I also saw that it touts that it's rust free. So these technically all metal lids are one-time use. However, the part of the canning lid that is reused is the ring. So we're working with a two-part system here. Here is the lid. It has a shiny metal outside, and then underneath it's got this nice coating that's BPA free, and the silicone ring here is also BPA free. All of this is safe to touch your food. See how it's beautiful? You can tell just by the color that it's different than a standard lid. Let me grab a ball. So we've got the ball lid here and the 4Jars lid here, and you can kind of tell the difference in the color. Holding it in my hand, I feel like I can definitely tell a difference in the quality with just the weight of it and the stability of it. This 4Jars lid is definitely a higher quality metal, and just looking at it underneath too, the silicone seal is actually a little bit wider on the 4Jars lid too. So I'm pretty excited to get to use these today. One of the things that is a little bit different with the 4Jars lids versus the ball lids is Ball doesn't necessarily recommend that you heat up your lids before canning. Now 4Jars does. I think it's part of their process, so I am going to put these guys in a little bit of a simmer before I put the lids on these jars. And while those are starting to simmer, I'm going to show you the difference in the rings too. So here is a regular Ball canning lid. After not that much time, it does not take long at all for these rings to really get rusty. And I like to use my dishwasher here, so that is what I use to clean my canning rings most of the time. But even when I don't, even when I try to hand wash them quickly and set them out on a towel to dry, they get rusted pretty much right away. And the rust on these is really what does in the life of these rings. It becomes hard to really get a good finger tight seal. That we'll go over that in just a minute, and it really can compromise the seal eventually because it doesn't have, with the rust, it doesn't have as good of a hold on the threading, and it can displace, which would ruin that particular jar of food. But here, the 4Jars lid, because it does have a little bit of stainless in it, in theory, now I haven't gotten to test it out, but I will. In theory, these won't rust either, and I'm super excited about that because it's going to extend the life of the rings, which obviously saves money because I do have to buy rings every so often, and honestly, it's not my favorite purchase. The instructions with the 4Jars lids say to bring them up to a boil, and then they should be good to go. So I'm going to fish them out with a fork. You can use a magnetic lid lifter that comes with a lot of canning kits, but I don't have one. So the 4Jars company did send me some regular mouth rings, but not the wide mouth rings. And because I'm using bone-in rabbit here, I am doing wide mouth jars. So I am going to be using the ball rings today because it's what I have. And we're going to be tightening all of these to fingertip tight. So I just did it there kind of quickly, but I'll show you what that looks like on the next few jars. So fingertip tight can feel a little bit elusive. It can feel like it's really a narrow margin for error, which I don't feel like you really need to worry too much about it. The goal is to make sure that the ring is secured tight enough where the lid during the process can still flex a little bit and burp. If you have it cranked on real tight, that can't happen. And what does happen in the canner is the whole thing, like the pressure has to go somewhere and the whole lid just pops off. And again, it's nothing catastrophic, it's just sad to have to clean up. It's just something to keep in mind and something to try to perfect. So in theory, you're going to be putting the ring on and using these 3 fingers, you're going to get the ring on as basically as tight as you can without, overdoing it with just these 3 fingers. So that is fingertip tight. It does not need to be any tighter than that. So So we've got all of our jars fingertip tight. I have a cold canner, or a cool canner, room temperature, with cool water inside. So in the Presto canner and in the handbook for the Presto canner, they suggest that you have about 2 to 3 inches of water at the bottom of the canner. Inside the Presto canner, there's actually a little notch, and that's what we would fill up to. So we have our jar rack in the bottom of the canner, as well as right around 2.5 inches of water. All right, so this is as full as the canner can get with quartz. There's a little bit of condensation inside here just because it was sitting on top of the canner with the water in it. But I have this ring here that comes out that I clean in between each canning session, and I need to make sure that that is well seated and looks like it doesn't have any warps or cracks or anything in it. There's also this safety release button that is the same kind of material. I just want to make sure that that looks to be in good condition, and then it has the ability to move around a little bit. We also have this safety button here on this side, and this is the locking mechanism. I want to make sure that that can freely move. And this here is our vent pipe. So we need to make sure that this is clear. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to hold the lid up to the light, put my eye up to it, and make sure that I can see a clear light straight through there, because this canner is going to need to vent. My Presto canner booklet also suggested just to hand tighten this, just to make sure that everything is good with the dial gauge. And I've never had that be loose or anything, but I always get into the habit of just making sure that all is good there. So when I place the canner, this lid onto the canner, I have to do so in a specific way. And one of the safety features of these canners is they don't allow you to do it any other way. So if the lid isn't going on, it's probably not being put on correctly. There actually is a little bit of an arrow thing here etched in, and we're going to be lining this up with the arrow that is on the pot part of the canner. So see here, we've got the arrow on the handle. I'm going to line up the arrow here with the arrow on the handle. There, and it sets down in. And the next step to make sure the lid is locked is I'm just going to twist the lid so that the black handles match up. And this is good and locked, and I can turn on the heat now. Now I use the term locked just now. I can still mess with it at this point in time. This little toggle up here is the actual locking mechanism, and this will engage when there is enough pressure inside the pot that would make it dangerous for us to remove the lid at all. And when this is engaged, we're going to be physically unable to get this lid off, which is a good thing because it would be unsafe for us to remove the lid at that time. So this is one of those built-in safety features that doesn't allow you to get hurt. The other one back here is this little safety release nozzle back here. So if the pressure inside the canner gets to be, I think it's over 20 psi, something crazy, something that really shouldn't happen unless you're just really not watching what you're doing. If the pressure gets to be too great, you don't have to worry about the lid just blowing a hole in your ceiling like we've seen with the old pressure cookers and things. We don't have to worry about that anymore because of this safety feature. This is designed to blow when it gets above that dangerous pressure, and all of the pressure will come out backwards this way. So it's not even going to steam burn anyone, and it's a really awesome safety feature that gives me a lot of peace of mind. So I've turned my burner up to high, and the goal is to get things bubbling and boiling in here and to get this canner to fill up with steam. I'm going to know that that is occurring because I'll be able to hear a little bit of a bubbling and boiling noise, but I'm also going to see steam starting to vent out of the top of this vent pipe here. And once we get a good steady stream that is blowing constantly, I'm going to set my timer for 10 minutes. All right, so we're almost getting to the time where we need to add our weight. When I first bought this pressure canner, it came with a weight that wasn't adjustable, and it was actually a 15-pound weight, which was really too much weight for my altitude or my elevation. I guess potato, I don't really know. But what you're going to want to do is figure out your elevation and figure out how much pounds of pressure that you're going to need to apply for your canning process in your area. So we are below 1,000 feet elevation here in southwestern Kentucky, so we can at 10 pounds of pressure. If we were above 1,000 feet elevation, we would be canning with that 15 pounds of pressure. That would be appropriate there. And honestly, I don't know the application for using only the 5 pounds of pressure. So I actually bought this weight separately from the canner when I learned that the one that it came with wasn't the right one for my elevation. And it came with the little weight itself plus 2 little rings that took it up by 5 pounds of pressure each. So the weight itself, this is 5 pounds, not like really, but this helps the canner maintain 5 pounds of pressure, and then adding this ring helps the canner maintain 10 pounds of pressure. And as we just heard, it is time to add this to the vent pipe. Watch right here. There it goes. See that? So actually guys, this is something good to show you. I'm noticing something about my canner that I've never noticed before. It's gonna make me turn it off. So back here, this little vent that I told you about that would blow if there got to be too much pressure in the canner, I have never seen it vent steam in the way that it's doing right now. So I'm going to stop the canning process right now, let everything come down out of pressure, and I'm actually going to replace that little nubbin because I do have an extra one and I've never done it before. So it's probably worn out enough and it's not filling the hole well enough in order to prevent steam from coming out, because that should not be happening right now. So once the pressure comes back down to 0, it's not going to take long because our weighted gauge wasn't on there very long. This button will drop and then I can safely remove the lid and replace the safety button back there. So you might not know, but it's 10:15 p.m. right now and I'm canning. So if I did not have an extra of these, I could be pretty darn frustrated right now, but I'm not, because I have prepared myself with extra sealing ring and extra little overpressure plug. So I have what I need, thankfully, and it's not gonna ruin my evening. Yep, it's in here. That little doodad, that's what I need. You can still hear it boiling in there, but because our little toggle here went down and because the dial gauge reads 0, it is safe to remove the lid. But I wanna take it off away from my face, because all that steam, I don't need a facial right now. So the lid is really hot. I'm gonna use this chopstick to pop the old button out, new button in the hole. There. Just like that, we're back in business. So because we had to halt the canning process, we have to start it all the way over. So we're going to be resecuring the lid, turning the burner back up, and then when it comes back up to boiling and up to steaming, we're gonna let it vent for another 10 minutes. It's really important to note, if you have a power outage or something like that that interrupts your canning process, you do have to start the timing and everything all over from the beginning. And it doesn't happen that often. So the only places that you really should be seeing steam come out are from this little lock button here. That's okay until it does lock into place. Sometimes it spurts a little bit of water. That is completely okay too. And obviously we want to see steam coming out of that steam vent. That's what that's for. Really, we don't want to see steam coming out from along the edge of the canner anywhere. And you shouldn't really see steam coming out of the button that we had steam coming out of back there, that valve. That shouldn't really steam, especially when this button is up, you're in the lock position and you have your weighted gauge on there. If you're seeing steam coming out of anywhere at that point, it probably means that you have a seal or one of these that needs replacing. But it's important to note too that if you didn't realize what was going on there, nothing catastrophic would have happened. It would have been really hard for the canner to keep and maintain a pressure, but it's not like anything would have exploded or anything real bad would have happened. You just might have been wondering why pressure was a little bit hard to maintain in the canner. That's really it. So that time, our lock button actually engaged before the 10-minute timer went up, which does happen. It sometimes is variable, but that will engage when there is enough pressure in the canner to trigger that. So it's time to add our 10-pound weight again. And as we can see now, there's no steam coming out of anywhere, which that is the goal. Everything is good. So our next step is to bring the canner up to a proper pressure before we can start our timer. So the quarts of rabbit with the bones needs to can for 75 full minutes. And my canning time is going to start when our 10-pound gauge here starts to jiggle a little bit. That's going to start moving when there's a little bit more than 10 pounds of pressure in the canner, and that jiggling is going to help the canner maintain that pressure. See how the needle reads 10 pounds of pressure now, but we're not jiggling? We need to trust the weight more than we trust the dial. Okay. Our jiggler is going. I'm going to turn the heat down to medium. So, but because the jiggler is going, I'm going to set my timer 75 minutes. Oops. There we go. And I want to be able to maintain a nice, slow, gentle rock of this jiggler the whole canning process. So it doesn't have to be going crazy. It's actually probably good if it doesn't go really fast with its jiggle, but I'm getting a nice gentle rock right here, and this is what I like to maintain for the full canning time. And as you can see, our dial gauge is reading something at about 11 and a half, but see that? That is perfect. So as long as we maintain that, we're good. And if the jiggler does happen to stop, it does not mean necessarily that you have to start the canning process all over. You can just increase the heat a little bit, and you should be able to kind of figure out with your canner and your stove where your sweet spot is going to be. So you can see it's barely rocking a little bit, and I don't really want it to stop. If it stops, it means that the pressure might be too low inside the canner, and then our food may not be safe. So I'm going to increase the heat a little. And we'll find that sweet spot. I won't have to babysit it like this intently this whole time. So this is what the canner is going to do for the next 75 minutes. And when you get comfortable with your canner, you can kind of do things around your house. Keep an ear out, keep an eye out, make sure that you are still having that gentle rock. While you're getting comfortable, you may pull up a chair and read a book, knit, something like that, until you know kind of what you can maintain as far as the temperature on your stove with your canner. But you could easily do something like the dishes, or maybe work on another recipe or something. It's not that you have to be like standing over it like a hawk for 75 minutes, but you don't want to be going outside like weeding the garden or something like that. You really want to be in earshot and preferably eye shot for the whole canning process. All right, so our 75 minutes is up, and now it's time to begin the cool down process, which is really easy at first. All we're going to do is shut off the burner and walk away. We don't want to take it off the burner or anything. What we're aiming for, let me shut it off first. What we're aiming for is to get all of the pressure out of the canner before we mess with it at all. So we do have 10 pounds of pressure in here still. The rocker's still going even though I've just shut it off. And this is where the dial gauge comes in handy again. So what we're looking for is we're going to wait to do anything else until the needle that's on this gauge goes all the way down to the 0. So at that point, it will be safe to remove the weighted gauge, but not until then. If you didn't have a canner that had the dial gauge, what you would do is wait for this locking mechanism, this safety pin, to drop. And that would mean that there's no more pressure inside the canner. And at that point, it would be safe to remove the weight. If we removed the weight now, it's not that the canner would explode. it wouldn't. What would happen is that all the steam would exit the canner really fast out of that spout, and it would actually cool down the jars too quickly. We don't want them cooling down too quickly, because if they do, there's a very high likelihood that the food that's inside the jars will quickly make its way out of the jars. There's going to be way too much of a pressure exchange, and you're possibly going to blow lids, but I think more likely is you're going to experience siphoning. So the food that's in the jar will work its way out of that tiny bit of flex that happens to allow some of the air to escape. The food is also going to escape, and you're very likely going to lose a lot of food, possibly not have your jars seal. So wait this out. It's a little bit of a process, but it's worth doing, that's for sure, and it's part of the recipe. So there are certain times and with certain foods that it's at this point, I'll shut the canner off and go to bed. And that's not technically correct, and because this is a canning 101, I'm going to stay up and I'm going to teach you the correct way to do things. The risk that you run with shutting off the canner and going to bed is that there's a thing called flat sour that can happen in certain canned foods. I've had it happen before with things like tomato sauce and other tomato products, and it's not going to make the food inedible. Like, it's not going to make you sick. There's just a heat-loving microorganism that does survive these high temperatures that can tend to proliferate in the slower cool down process that can happen when you just shut it off and go to bed. And it just makes things a little bit off tasting. It definitely tastes a little bit sour, like it adds an acidity to it that is really off-putting. But at least with the tomato sauce, I know you can add sugar and it's no big deal, but it's something that you kind of want to be mindful of and you want to avoid in the first place. And the way to avoid getting flat sour in your food is following the cool down procedures properly. Now, I will say I've never had a problem with flat sour in anything other than tomato products. I can meat all the time, I can broth all the time, and I pretty much always shut it off and go to bed, but that's not the technical right answer, so let's try to follow the rules. All right, so the gauge reads 0, our safety button is down, so that means that there is effectively no pressure left in the canner. So I'm gonna take off our weighted gauge here, and that's going to allow a little bit of cool air to enter the canner and allow things to cool down a little bit more quickly, but still slowly enough. So right now I need to vent the canner again. Now there's no steam coming out, but it's still considered venting. This is the cool down venting, and that happens for 10 minutes as well. All right, timer went off. I'm just going to twist the lid to the side. Again, open it away from my face. I've got these cool little canning tongs to reach into the canner and pull out our jars. So you may see and feel when you remove some of the jars from the canner that some of the rings seem a little bit loose. Don't touch them. Resist the urge to tighten them because you can easily mess up the seal at this point. One of the ways that I can tell that I'm going to get a good seal on a pressure canned jar is if it's a product with some liquid in it, like these, if it's still boiling when I pull it out of the canner. So products that are under a vacuum actually boil at a lower temperature. So the canner's not boiling, but these guys are, and it's because they are experiencing that vacuum. And pretty soon here, we should start hearing the telltale ping of a well-sealed jar. So we'll wait for it. It's kind of funny that the slogan on the towel that 4 Jars sent me says, 4 Jars lids always pops. Yeah, that's what it says. And none of them popped. But I will tell you, it doesn't mean that they're not properly sealed. I've actually seen it quite a few times where the lid, the pressure inside the vacuum settles out slowly enough where the button, the part of the lid that tells you if it's sealed or not sealed, will slowly come down. And it doesn't always have that tension on it to make it go bing or pop or whatever. And it looks like literally every single one of these has done that slower seal, which is completely fine and is completely safe. I actually have some plastic Tatler lids here. You may have seen these before. These don't have a pop option at all, just because of what they're made out of. So the way that you can tell these are sealed is after a good 12 hours, you can remove the rings and then pick up the jar from the lid, and if everything stays together, then you have a good seal. And there's also a way that you can tell if things are sealed by tapping on the lid. I'm gonna avoid doing that right now because everything is still settling out. You really want to avoid pushing down any of the buttons or touching the lids or jars really at all for a good 12 hours. Let them cool down, let things settle out as they will, because you don't want to artificially seal a jar where maybe it wouldn't have if you didn't touch it. So just leave it alone. I'm gonna go to bed. Alrighty guys, so it's the next morning. It has not been 12 hours, but these are completely cooled, and it looks like all of our 4 jars lids have completely sealed, as I expected they would. So what we're going to do in order to store our newly canned rabbit is actually take off the rings, and we're gonna wipe everything down. One thing that I forgot to mention is if you want to keep the jars a little bit cleaner, you can add a splash of vinegar to your pot before canning, and it helps keep things just a little bit cleaner. There's a little bit like of a greasy film on the outside, but it's no problem that I forgot that. It's gonna wash off fine. So I'm just gonna damp microfiber cloth here, and I'm just gonna get everything off of the outside of the jar. It's just gonna help keep things nice, keep critters away from it. And as far as the lid goes, it's just gonna help make sure that the markings that I put on the top are going to stay on well. So there's a couple different ways that we can test for a proper seal on our cooled jars. So the main thing that you really want to do is push down on the center of the lid and make sure that it doesn't flex back up. So I have this honey jar back here, and this has not been heat sealed or anything, and you can hear that it's not a sealed jar. So if we were to get a pop like that, we would know that the jar needs to go straight in the refrigerator or be reprocessed. But everything is good there, and if we wanted to double check it, you can pick up the canned food by the lid, and it should absolutely stay on. You don't want to be lifting it super high, because if it does fall off, you don't want a huge mess, but you don't have to lift it very high to test it out. So that all checks out. And another way that you can check for either a bad seal or a weaker seal is by tapping the top with your fingernail or a pen or something like that. And they are going to sound a little different just because of one of them might have a little bit more food in it than another, but you really don't want a drastic difference in sound. And we're going to use the honey jar here to give us the good example of the major difference that you'll hear. So high pitch. Like, you can really hear the difference. And it may sound a little bit different on a jar that kind of tried to seal but didn't quite, but when you get a jar like that, you're gonna know it, and it needs to go straight in the fridge. That does not happen very often. Because different lids can be made out of different materials, you don't really want to test the tapping theory with different brands of lids. So we have the 4 jars over here, and then this one, I don't know what the brand is, and this one, I don't know what the brand is. I bought these both at our local Amish store, and they do sound different for different reasons. One is, like I said, the makeup of the lid, or the size of the jar, or the contents of the jar. So you're gonna hear differences when you tap like this. It doesn't mean that this one is bad. It's actually not. It's completely fine. It's just a different lid. So we need to label the jars before we put them away. I'm just gonna mark what's the contents of the jar as rabbit. And as far as the date goes, all that's really necessary is the month and the year. We don't need to know exactly what day that we can this up. Just a general time frame is good, and this should be good on the shelf for 18 months or longer. So the reason that we're going to store our jars without the ring on them is to prevent any kind of resealing that could be a false sealing. So sometimes as time goes on and as temperatures fluctuate in the storage area of your jars, you can get a seal failure. And if you have a seal failure with the ring on, there's a potential that when conditions change, like when it cools down again, that lid could reseal back onto the jar. And because that jar wouldn't have gone through the heat processing necessary, there is a chance that that food could be bad, but you may not know it because it will have resealed. That's completely prevented when you store it with the rings off, so it's highly suggested that you do so. Plus, if we kept the rings on the jars, we wouldn't be able to reuse the rings as often. And honestly, this is where I think 4 jars really wins against any other canning company, even Tatler. If these canning rings truly are rust-free, this is a game changer for me. And so if you would like to try out the 4 jars lids and the rings alongside me, I do have an affiliate link that I'm going to put in the description box below, and I have a coupon code for you, SageAndStone10, I believe it is. I'm going to put the words right here of the exact coupon code that you should use for 10% off. This is my first time using these lids, but I really feel like I'm going to love them, and I think you will as well. And as promised, if you want to hear more about the steam canner and how all of that works, I'm going to link this video up here. And if you are curious about rabbit meat and what the heck all of that is about, I am going to link my Raising Rabbits playlist here. It's one of our favorite meats to raise on our homestead.